The chamber of the Galactic Council was a cathedral of light and echo, a vast dome suspended in orbit above a gas giant whose storms rolled endlessly below. Delegates from 100 worlds gathered beneath crystalline arches that had seen centuries of peace sealed with words, not blood. For all the differences, scaled, feathered, silicon, or soft-fleshed, they shared a single conviction: diplomacy was the highest expression of civilization. War, to them, was the ancient shame left behind long ago. When humanity first crossed into council space, hope had bloomed. Here was a young species with fire in their veins, rich with potential, hardened by their homeworld's brutality but tempered with curiosity. The first envoys had carried offers of trade, technology, and mutual defense. Protocol dictated that newcomers hesitated, asked questions, debated terms. That was natural. But the expectation was always the same: eventually, every species bent to the Council's order, seeing reason in unity. But the humans did not bend. They did not even pause to consider. Messages sent by the Council's finest diplomats were returned with curt declarations. "We are not interested in treaties. We govern ourselves. We will not sit beneath another's banner." It was not simple hesitation. It was not misunderstanding. It was rejection, clear and final. At first, the delegates dismissed it as bravado, the arrogance of a young species not yet humbled by history. Surely, once they saw the weight of the Council arrayed against them, the fleets, the markets, the knowledge of 1,000 civilizations, they would come to heel. No one could thrive alone in the stars. Isolation was death, and every people who had once tried to resist had eventually come crawling into the chamber, desperate for food, technology, or protection. Yet weeks passed, and then months, and the humans remained unmoved. The Council offered again: mutual prosperity, shared defense, cultural exchange. The humans replied again, unwavering: "We will not sign. We will not submit." The tone was not hostile, but final. It was as though they were speaking not to the most powerful political body in known space, but to a nuisance knocking on their door. The shock rippled through the chamber like a physical blow. For the first time in living memory, a species had refused not just membership, but diplomacy itself. The Council was not accustomed to defiance. Their power was subtle, their influence immense, and for centuries no one had dared to deny them. Now, a single stubborn voice had shattered the illusion of inevitability. Whispers spread among the delegations. Some suspected madness. Others feared that humanity's nature was fundamentally incompatible with galactic order. Their homeworld's history was one of endless struggle, records filled with conflict so constant that many could scarcely comprehend how they had survived. Perhaps, some muttered, violence was etched into their biology. And yet, despite that suspicion, there was something more unsettling, a sense that the humans did not see themselves as weaker, did not see themselves as outnumbered. They spoke as equals, or perhaps even as superiors, as though the weight of the Council meant nothing to them. This struck at the foundation of everything the Council believed. Diplomacy worked because everyone agreed that to resist the collective was impossible. To refuse unity was to choose annihilation. But the humans did not appear afraid. They did not waver when threatened with exclusion. They did not soften when promised riches. They simply stood alone, unshaken. The council chamber echoed with confusion. Delegates demanded explanations, as though the refusal itself were an error to be corrected. But the records of the exchanges left no room for doubt. Humanity was not playing for time. Humanity was not angling for better terms. Humanity was declaring that no terms would ever be accepted. For the first time in centuries, the council felt the stirrings of something they thought extinct: uncertainty. What if this species truly meant to remain apart? What if they did not need the council at all? And if they succeeded, if they carved their own path without bowing to the galactic order, what would that mean for others who quietly chafed under council authority? In the silence that followed, one truth weighed heavier than any other: a precedent had been broken. The galaxy was no longer a place where diplomacy was inevitable, where order was certain. A new variable had entered the equation, one no delegate had prepared for, and it bore the face of humanity. The council convened again, urgency pressing against the walls of the chamber like a storm. Delegates filled the air with sound, voices rising in overlapping languages, tones strained with disbelief. The rejection by humanity had grown from an insult into a dilemma. Centuries of order, built on the assumption that every species could be reasoned with, now trembled under the weight of a single refusal. One of the elder species, their crystalline bodies refracting light like prisms, spoke first with calm authority. They reminded the chamber that resistance was always temporary. Isolation led to collapse, and collapse drove all peoples to the council eventually. Their words carried confidence, but beneath the harmonics, there was unease. Humanity was not showing signs of collapse. Others countered. An insected chancellor hissed warnings of danger, reminding all that the humans expanded quickly into marginal worlds. While most species required fertile planets and intricate terraforming, humans thrived on frostbitten rocks, deserts stripped of water, and asteroids that no one else would claim. To them, hardship was not deterrence but a challenge. The Chancellor's mandibles clicked in frustration as they demanded to know why the Council tolerated such a threat at their borders. Aquatic delegates from ocean worlds urged patience. Their societies had known centuries of slow adaptation, gradual integration into galactic order. They believed humanity's resistance came from ignorance, not hostility. To them, more envoys, more translators, more cultural exchanges would eventually melt the barrier. They pleaded that humanity not be antagonized, warning that force would only deepen their isolation. The chamber split along these lines. Moderates urged diplomacy, hardliners demanded containment, scholars asked for deeper study. Reports from observers painted an image that unsettled everyone. Humans ignored embargoes, rerouted supply chains, and adapted with a speed that defied models. They did not collapse under the first waves of sanction. Instead, they grew more inventive. Block a port, and they carved another route. Restrict energy, and they found substitutes from worlds deemed barren by others. Their capacity to endure disruption was unlike anything the Council had recorded. One scholar, a being of shifting bioluminescent patterns, presented records of humanity's homeworld conflicts. Wars that had consumed continents, yet from the ashes, they rebuilt stronger. Famine, plague, climate upheaval, conditions that would have ended lesser civilizations, were scars etched into human memory. The scholar argued that the Council misunderstood them. Humans did not see hardship as failure. They saw it as proof of survival. To attempt coercion would not weaken them. It would sharpen them. These words drew silence across the chamber. For many, the realization was disquieting. Diplomacy relied on leverage, offers of wealth, threats of deprivation, promises of security. But what leverage existed against the people who saw deprivation as normal and sacrifice as expected? The hardliners would not yield. They demanded action, warning that if humanity remained unchecked, their defiance might inspire others. If one species could resist the Council and survive, what would stop others from following the same path? Order was fragile, and precedent was dangerous. They called for blockades to expand, for fleets to patrol human borders, for pressure so immense that no species could ever imagine resisting again. The moderates recoiled at the suggestion. They remembered the devastation of the few conflicts that had scarred the Council's history. War was forbidden for good reason. It destabilized not only systems, but belief itself. The Council's entire foundation rested on peace through unity. To shatter that with violence risked undoing the order that had endured for ages. Yet the reports kept coming, and each one eroded confidence. Colonies of humans thriving where embargoes should have broken them. Settlements growing on barren moons, improvising with machines repurposed from mining and salvage. Merchants whispering of human black markets bypassing every sanction. Each revelation widened the gulf between what the Council expected and what humanity delivered. By the session's end, consensus could not be reached. A vote was forced, the chamber split nearly in half. The moderates secured temporary restraint, but the margin was narrow, and the hardliners left with promises that if humanity continued to resist, harsher measures would be unavoidable. When the chamber emptied, unease lingered. For the first time in centuries, the Council was not certain of the future. A single young species had forced the galaxy's oldest powers into paralysis. The question no delegate dared to voice but all carried within them was simple: what if humanity could not be made to yield at all? Humanity never saw the Council as inevitable. From the beginning, the message was consistent: they would chart their own course without permission, without dependence, without oversight. Their history made the reasoning clear. On Earth, empires had risen and fallen, revolutions had toppled tyrants, and peoples had fought bitterly for independence. No single authority had ever commanded universal obedience for long, and that legacy burned deeply into their cultural marrow. When the Council extended offers of membership, humanity did not see peace and prosperity. They saw chains, even if gilded. The refusal was not born of ignorance. Human leaders knew exactly what the Council represented: stability enforced through conformity, power disguised as benevolence. But to a species forged by centuries of distrust toward distant rulers, the idea of surrendering autonomy was an unacceptable cost. Their stance was not framed as aggression but as principle: sovereignty above all else. That principle united them in a way that Council analysts had not predicted. The human factions, so often divided by politics and rivalry, now spoke with one voice when confronted with outside pressure. When the Council moved to isolate them, many expected immediate collapse. Instead, humanity adapted. Deprived of established trade networks, they leaned on ingenuity. Scarcity was met with improvisation. Colonists converted cargo vessels into hydroponic farms, extracting every calorie from systems others dismissed as barren. Engineers dismantled obsolete mining platforms and turned them into power stations. Communities pooled resources in acts of solidarity that confounded analysts who expected selfish fragmentation. Hardship became fuel for innovation, not weakness. What alarmed observers most was not only survival but momentum. Rather than shrinking under sanctions, humanity pushed harder into unexplored regions. Where others required delicate terraforming and decades of preparation, humans adapted with speed. On airless rocks they built domes from salvaged alloys. On frozen worlds they tunneled into crusts of ice and carved warmth from geothermal vents. To them, uninhabitable was merely a challenge to solve. While blockades restricted familiar routes, humans pioneered new ones through neglected corridors, taking risks others deemed unacceptable. Council intelligence noted another troubling pattern: humans thrived under adversity because they expected it. Their cultures had been conditioned to face scarcity, disaster, and conflict as constants. Where deprivation might break another society's morale, for humans it affirmed their identity. Messages broadcast to their colonies reinforced this. We endure. We adapt. We do not yield. Instead of complaints, there was defiance, and instead of despair, there was pride. Attempts at persuasion fell flat. Delegates sent with assurances of wealth and protection were met with polite but firm rejection. Offers of shared technology were declined with a simple explanation: dependence was a weakness, and humanity would not be weak. Even veiled threats were returned with words that unsettled the chamber. If you cut us off, we will find our own way. If you press us, we will resist. If you attack us, we will fight until either side remains. What began as disbelief within the Council hardened into fear. It was not only the scale of human determination but the clarity of it. They were not seeking confrontation, yet they would never bow. They rejected not only diplomacy but the very foundation on which the Council rested, that unity was inevitable. To humanity, unity under foreign authority was another name for submission, and submission was death of the spirit. Every intelligence update reinforced the same message. Human colonies reported record growth despite shortages. Black markets thrived, not as hidden crimes but as celebrated ingenuity. Ships built from scrap performed tasks thought impossible. The Council's models, designed on centuries of precedent, failed to account for a species that embraced difficulty rather than feared it. In private, some delegates admitted the truth aloud: the humans were not behaving as an immature race in need of guidance. They were acting with the confidence of a power unwilling to accept equals, let alone superiors. They had looked at the galaxy's grandest coalition and decided that they did not require it. The realization spread like cracks through the Council's certainty. No matter the pressure, humanity did not bend. No matter the offers, they did not waver. Where other species had sought survival by integration, humanity claimed survival through independence. It was a declaration louder than any weapon, more destabilizing than any fleet. They had chosen to stand apart, and nothing in the Council's arsenal of persuasion could move them from that choice. The Council eventually acted, convinced that measured force would achieve what persuasion and sanctions had failed to accomplish. They labeled the campaign a peacekeeping intervention, a phrase chosen carefully to disguise its true intent, to bend humanity into compliance without admitting to war. Fleets were dispatched to the outer colonies, expecting that the sight of overwhelming power would compel surrender. To the Council, it was procedure. To humanity, it was provocation. The first encounters did not unfold as predicted. Council ships entered human-controlled systems expecting no resistance, only to face improvised defenses assembled from mining equipment and industrial platforms. What should have been trivial targets became hazards as asteroids were shifted into new orbits, orbital stations converted into weapons, and civilian craft retrofitted with armor and armaments. The Council had anticipated disorganized resistance, but instead they met strategy, deliberate, calculated, and ruthless. Reports from commanders were tinged with disbelief. Human crews were not merely resisting, they were fighting with an intensity that defied logic. Outnumbered and outgunned, they launched attacks designed not for survival but for maximum disruption. A single corvette would throw itself into a formation, crippling larger vessels before being destroyed. Miners and stripped-down freighters rammed supply ships, cutting off essential lines. Every loss inflicted by humanity cost them dearly, yet they accepted those losses as inevitable. The Council had no framework for such behavior. Their species had abandoned the idea of total sacrifice generations ago. They valued stability and preservation above all. Humans, however, treated survival as inseparable from resistance. Defeat was not an option, even if victory required annihilation. This mindset rattled commanders who could not comprehend why a people would willingly fight battles they had no chance of winning on paper. Over weeks, patterns emerged that unsettled strategists further. Humans adapted at a speed unmatched in Council history. Each engagement revealed new tactics: drones repurposed from agricultural bots, electronic warfare systems assembled from stolen components, environments turned into weapons. They used radiation belts to mask ambushes, detonated fuel depots to create traps, and weaponized debris fields as barriers. What began as crude improvisation evolved rapidly into sophisticated doctrine, one the Council had no counter for. The most devastating blow came during a fleet action near a frontier system. The Council had deployed overwhelming numbers, certain of decisive victory. Instead, they were drawn into an ambush. Human ships, disguised as merchant convoys, lured them into a dense asteroid cluster rigged with explosives. When the trap was sprung, entire wings were torn apart in seconds, and the survivors were harried relentlessly by smaller, faster vessels. By the time the fleet retreated, nearly half had been lost. The news shook the Council to its core. A campaign intended as demonstration had instead exposed weakness. Diplomats scrambled to contain the narrative, but transmissions from humanity spread faster than official statements. Across the galaxy, countless species witnessed the defiance, humans proclaiming their refusal to kneel, their willingness to fight until the end. What had begun as a local conflict now became a spectacle of rebellion. In the chambers of power, panic took root. Delegates demanded explanations, accusing each other of underestimating the threat. Analysts warned that the longer the conflict stretched, the stronger humanity became. Every attempt to suppress them taught them more, hardened their resolve, and widened the gap between expectation and reality. Each failed intervention made them appear less like outliers and more like pioneers of resistance. The Council was not merely facing a stubborn species. They were confronting an idea that could not be killed with fleets or starved with blockades. Humanity's defiance was contagious. Already, whispers spread among discontented peoples in distant systems, voices asking why they should accept the Council's rule when humanity proved it was possible to survive outside it. No matter how the delegates debated, one truth grew undeniable: the illusion of inevitability was breaking. Humanity had turned pressure into strength, had turned resistance into victory, and in doing so had forced the galaxy to confront a reality it had long denied. They were not just refusing diplomacy. They were rewriting the rules of power itself. The Council had always believed in permanence. Its authority rested on the certainty that no civilization could thrive without its embrace. Yet after the defeats, after the failed blockades and the shattered fleets, certainty was gone. What remained was fear, not only of humanity's strength but of what that strength represented. The delegates returned to session in an atmosphere heavy with unease. The chamber that once rang with confidence now echoed with doubt. Hardliners argued for escalation, demanding full-scale war to extinguish the human anomaly before it spread further. Their speeches dripped with desperation, but even they faltered when reminded of the losses already suffered. If limited campaigns had ended in disaster, what would total war invite? The prospect of endless conflict with an enemy that refused surrender chilled even the most militant voices. Others urged retreat, admitting that humanity could not be broken without endangering the very fabric of galactic stability. They whispered that perhaps the humans should be left alone, a dangerous but isolated outlier. But this too unsettled the chamber, for it meant acknowledging the first permanent exception in living memory. If one species could exist outside the Council's order, then others could follow. The precedent was corrosive, and everyone knew it. Amid the debate, the latest human broadcasts arrived. They did not gloat, nor did they negotiate. The message was stark, carried across the stars with clarity. We will not be ruled. We will not be threatened into submission. We stand alone. If you come to us in peace, we will meet you as equals. If you come to us with chains, we will break them, even if it costs us everything. The words struck harder than any weapon. For the Council, it was inconceivable. No species had ever declared equality with them, and meant it. To speak such defiance was one thing, to demonstrate the capacity to enforce it was another. Humanity had done both. Delegates who had once dismissed them as reckless now sat in silence, confronted with the reality that their order was no longer universal. The very notion that diplomacy could bind every civilization had been shattered. No envoy, no fleet, no sanction had swayed humanity. They remained unbent, and in their refusal, they proved the galaxy's greatest assumption false. Reports continued to flow in, each one deepening the wound. Human colonies expanded at a pace that no blockade could slow. Trade networks hidden from Council oversight flourished, sustained by daring captains who thrived in danger. Technologies born of necessity gave them an edge in environments no one else dared settle. Every attempt to contain them had instead strengthened their identity as a people who endured through defiance. The Council faced a truth it could neither deny nor undo: humanity could not be absorbed. They would not kneel, and they could not be erased without catastrophic cost. To confront them was to invite losses that would weaken the Council irreparably. To ignore them was to admit that the galaxy's great order had limits. Both choices cut at the foundation of centuries of dominance. And yet, beyond fear, there was awe. Some delegates admitted privately that the humans embodied qualities long forgotten: the will to fight without certainty of victory, the resolve to sacrifice for principle, the ability to turn adversity into strength. To some, they were a menace. To others, a reminder of what survival had once required before peace dulled the galaxy's edges. In the end, no resolution was reached. The Council could neither conquer nor coerce, and so they chose silence. Humanity remained outside, untamed, unbroken, a power apart. The galaxy adjusted around them, grudgingly acknowledging their existence, uncertain whether to fear or to admire. For humanity, the outcome was never in doubt. They had refused every offer, endured every sanction, resisted every fleet. Their path was their own, carved not through permission but through defiance. They had shown that sovereignty could not be negotiated away, that freedom could not be traded for security. Where others saw impossibility, they saw only another challenge to overcome. The galaxy would remember their words long after the Council's debates had faded. A species had stood before the greatest power known and said no. They had endured every consequence and emerged stronger. In doing so, they had changed the order of things forever. For the first time in centuries, the Council understood that diplomacy was not universal, that not every people could be bound by law or lured by promise. There existed, at the edge of known space, a species that rejected inevitability itself. And the name of that species carried across every star, spoken with fear and admiration alike: humanity.